So when Warren and I started this series, well, when we started doing lectures here about 2 years ago, we thought we'd record them, put them online. You know, if people couldn't make it to the club on a Wednesday and now Thursday night, they could watch them on YouTube. And we put them on there, didn't really expect much out of it, and the channel's gotten pretty popular, which is fine. That's great. I'm glad there are people who are there looking at chess. It's just my name. It's called Lucas Andersson. People have watched the matches or watched the lectures, and they've put in a lot of comments, and I was surprised that it'd take time to moderate all those comments. Some great constructive comments and some not so constructive that I had to moderate and remove. But that is
the internet.
How the internet, right? It is what it is. But by and large, the chess community is good, but sometimes people get upset that I talk about politics in Azerbaijan, or when I talked about Capablanca and the political side of it there, people get a little annoyed. But it is what it is. And one of the most surprising things that happened is I was contacted by a guy named Fabio Biaggi, who was contacting me from Italy. And he said, "Oh, I see you used one of my photos." This was of Karpov in my Karpov lecture. And I thought, oh, crap, I hope he doesn't sue me. Now, I put images in, and I consider it fair use because it's educational purposes, and I don't monetize the content. I don't put in ads or anything like that. So I thought, I hope he doesn't mind. And he said, no, it's fine. In fact, if you want, I have other photos. I was the official match photographer for the USSR versus the world number 2 in London of 1984, and I have some pictures that have never been published. That sounded intriguing. Well, this was back in November, and Warren and I had the candidates lectures planned out all the way through February, February. But I was looking forward to doing this lecture, and I've been working in collaboration with him for a couple of months now, and he sent me lots of photos, and he's also sent me some thoughts, anecdotes, remembrances, that sort of thing. So you're going to see mostly his photos. You're going to see some other photos as well for context, and sometimes you're going to see quotes from him as well. And I've tried to be attentive to mark when photos did not come from him and came from other sources if it wasn't obvious. But for the most part, these are his photos, and they've never before been seen. And I start with the title slide of Viktor Korchnoi and Ulf Andersson. Viktor Korchnoi had board number 3. Ulf Andersson had board 1. You're going to see that they were pretty pivotal characters in this story. So if it's your first time here, you're welcome. I'm glad to get to know you. Warren and I collaborate teaching in a high school team, and we do this kind of for fun, but certainly glad to have people as enthusiastic about us as we are. Now, Fabio Biaggi, I have him pictured here with Tal, actually. Here he is presenting Tal with one of his photographs, posing for a photograph himself with Tal. He certainly, I asked him which photo I should use to kind of commemorate him, and he asked me to use this one, and I think it is fitting. Before we get into the chess, I need to give you some political backdrop here. 1979, December of 1979, the USSR invades Afghanistan, and President Carter sends aid to the guerrilla movements, the Mujahideen, and Reagan continues that policy of supporting this armed uprising against the Soviet Union. And here you see him meeting with various representatives of various tribes in Afghanistan in 1983. It's important to establish that Reagan had a very different approach than his predecessors. The approach had been détente, prevent communism from spreading, keep spheres of influence. So the United States had a sphere of influence in the Middle East through Israel, and USSR had a sphere of influence through the Western Hemisphere through Cuba. And it was kind of a tit-for-tat thing, but the idea was they'd keep each other from expanding, and this explains, to some extent, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, etc. So Reagan decides that not only are we going to prevent communist-backed regimes from spreading, we're going to try to, quote, roll back those regimes. So Afghanistan was a start, Nicaragua, of course the Iran-Contra affair, Angola, Cambodia, a couple of other governments. Reagan sought to roll back those communist advances. Well, this had lots of effects. First, the war in Afghanistan was seen as a way for the United States to degrade the USSR's ability to wage war and to precipitate an economic collapse of the Soviet Union. Caspar Weinberger, the U.S. Secretary of Defense in 1984, basically laid out the strategy. And there's a good history of Afghanistan doing this. Afghanistan thwarted Alexander the Great and the Persian Empire. It thwarted Great Britain through the Afghan Wars. There are 3 of them in the 19th and 20th centuries. It thwarted Russia to a certain extent, and perhaps you could say the United States. Despite our intervention, now Afghanistan is still pretty unstable. Incidentally, this same strategy was used by all people Osama bin Laden. We know him as a terrorist, who backed 9/11, but he actually believed in the ability to degrade the United States' ability to wage war through these guerrilla activities. He said in 2004, this is in addition to our having experience in guerrilla warfare and the war of attrition to fight tyrannical superpowers, as we, alongside the Mujahideen, bled Russia for 10 years until it went bankrupt and was forced to withdraw and defeat. So we are continuing this policy and bleeding America to the point of bankruptcy. I don't want to get all political, but to a certain extent, the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, you can say that they certainly were very costly for the United States. One economist at Harvard estimates that those 2 wars combined have and will cost $4 to $6 trillion overall. To a certain extent, Afghanistan was a key point in the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, and that actually transferred over to sports. You may remember that in 1980, out of protest, the United States and 59 other countries boycotted the Summer Olympics in Moscow, did not attend. In 1984, the Olympics were scheduled to be held in Los Angeles, and the USSR boycotted along with 12 or 13 other nations. You see them highlighted in red here, and they are basically communist regimes. There was a tit for tat in the fact that they were boycotting each other's Olympics, and it was a very difficult time in the Cold War, and it was part of the cultural Cold War. And there are a couple of reasons for this. The Russian or Soviet Olympic Committee said that they couldn't participate because the U.S. was using it for political aims, and they didn't participate in other things because they declared that the United States could not ensure security for their participants. And some people say, well, that's because they wanted to prevent defections. They didn't want people to their athletes to arrive in Los Angeles and demand political asylum. So some people say that the defections were motivated more by that than what the Soviet Union ostensibly claimed, but it's kind of impossible to know for sure. However, what we do know is that chess, even during the Cold War, kind of transcended the poor relationship between the USSR and the United States. You may recall that the USSR versus the rest of the world, the first tournament was held in Yugoslavia in 1970. The world had a very strong team on the top few boards. They had Bent Larsen, they had Bobby Fischer, Portisch, Hort, Gligerich. They had all these strong players toward the top, and at the top you can see, it's kind of hard to read, but you can see that Fischer dominated Petrosian, that Larsen played evenly with Boris Spassky and then picked up a point off of Leonid Stein. You see that Portisch had a plus record, Hort had a plus record. So these players did very well on the top few boards for the world team, but the Soviet Union had the depth. I mean, look at boards 5 through 10, Geller, Smyslov, Taimanov, Botvinnik, Tal, Karas. Good luck. So they have world champions and former world champions and candidates and really strong players all the way through their lineup. So even though the U.S. or the rest of the world was able to field a pretty strong team at the top, they lost 20.5 to 19.5. And there's kind of an open invitation for a rematch. Now, this didn't occur for many, many years, mostly because, it takes financial backing to get a tournament like this going. But it just goes to show that even at the height of the Cold War, the USSR and the rest of the world could come together and kind of transcend those political boundaries through chess. And we're going to see quite a bit of that when we discuss the second iteration of this match. But I know you guys also came here for chess. So we're going to look at 4 games tonight. And for the first, we're going to look at Karpov versus Andersson. This is board 1 and round 1. And I don't have any images or anything to set this up for you. But understand that this is Anatoly Karpov, the world's top player, fighting very hard for a win. So as always, for analysis, I'll turn it over to Warren.
So actually, in the first round of this match between USSR in the world, it was close. And in fact, this game that I'm about to show you with Karpov, it was the last game to finish of the round, and USSR trailed by a full point. So Karpov had to win, or else USSR would lose the first round. So this was an important game. So to kind of set the stage, Ulf Andersson had a really hard time against Karpov. By the time they both stopped playing chess seriously, Karpov had 12 wins to Andersson's 1. So Karpov dominated Andersson, basically. At the time they had played, and Karpov already had a pretty strong record. I didn't count the number of wins, but one of Andersson's first and only wins against Karpov came early on in Karpov's career. So that just sets the stage. So Andersson knew he was going to have a difficult time on board 1. So we have a Bogo Indian, and really probably not a good choice in retrospect for Andersson, because this is the kind of position where Karpov is at home, where he can just play forever, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. So although White doesn't have anything special in particular, Black has kind of a problem with that C8 bishop, and White has no weaknesses. So it's a pretty safe position for White, even though you could say the same about Black. So this b4 move is very typical of this kind of Carlsbad pawn structure. The Carlsbad pawn structure is we have e3 and d4 against d5 and c6. Although Black hasn't played it yet, it's pretty much inevitable, right? So this b4 move starts a minority attack. So what White will like to do is exchange both these pairs of pawns, and then give Black a weak backwards pawn on c6 that he can target. This is kind of his dream situation. Although Andersson does a good job of defending that here, he gives himself other problems, as we'll see. So White works on putting a knight on c5. And so, although Andersson stopped White from playing b5, now the b file is open. So Black has this kind of permanent weakness on b7. And here's where Karpov realized that he couldn't win just by attacking b7, because Black can guard it with both of these rooks, as he's already doing, and the queen. And there's really no other way for him to attack the b7 pawn. So instead of that, he's going to patiently try to break through on the king side. And when I say patiently, I mean patiently. This is a great example of some grandmasterly chess right here. A lot of times, I see so often in amateur games, people will just lash out. If there's nothing immediate, they'll just play a really risky, dangerous move instead of just keeping the position. And King F1 is just a great example of just patience. I had a game a long time ago where I had a good position against someone, and I ruined it by lashing out, and my coach, criticized me heavily. He couldn't believe I did that, and he just said, you don't have to do all your work. Your opponent is perfectly capable of losing a chess game. So let your opponent take some of the burden too. And this is a good example of that. So King F1 just keeps the position. It's a really nice move. Now, like I talked about, so White might want to break on the king side. So Karpov says, maybe I'll put my king on the queen side where Black doesn't have any pieces, and then I can open up the king side. So it'll be maybe a better situation. Tucks it away on A1. And now he finally makes some semblance of activity opening up the position. Again, White makes these kind of what will look like non-moves. Now the king goes back to the king side. Psychologically, I love this kind of play because it's almost like he's telling his opponent, what are you going to do? I'm just going to play around, do something. I love the attitude. I love. I saw a comment someone made on chess games where they wished Karpov would have played rook g4 here and made it Karpov's gun, you know, rook, queen, and king, as opposed to Alyekin's gun, right? But unfortunately, he only played this move, right? Yeah, I love the patience here. Karpov doesn't have anything immediate, so he's just waiting. Now, White's break eventually is going to be to play e4 and take over the e-file, since all of Black's pieces are tied up on the g-file. But since he doesn't have to, he's not. He's just waiting. Maybe Black will put his pieces in a terrible situation that he can take advantage of. So he's moving his king. I like this move a lot, actually. It's another one of those just like non-moves. Like, okay, your turn. And finally, he decides the moment's right to break open the position. You know, eventually we'll get to the 50 move rule, right? So you got to make a pawn move. Now already some tactics are surfacing. So rook e7 wouldn't be possible because of what? You know how I talked about, you know, letting Andersson put his pieces in unfortunate locations? So here's a perfect example. So if Andersson played rook e7 trying to exchange rooks and keep control of the e-file, how could Karpov win now? No, rook takes rook. Queen takes would be what Black wants. Queen e3? Yeah, queen e3, right? Fork. Check, and the rook on e7. So White wins a rook. So unfortunately, Black is going to lose control over the e-file. Opening up the king side. And now White's threat of rook e8 is nice. So there's a nice variation. So queen takes d4, trying to snatch that pawn, doesn't work. Because White can now win by rook check, takes. And does anyone see how White wins now? White has a really cute move here.
Queen takes f5?
Yeah, exactly. Black has a problem because White threatens queen h3 mate, and we can't take the rook because it's checkmate. Yeah. Mating with pawn in good style, of course. So there's nothing really Black can do. We have something like rook g4, rook h3 is checkmate, right? So Black has nothing. So the pawn is taboo, so he gives a check, but the king is surprisingly safe on h3. And now White gets a winning endgame. And finally, Andersson decided to resign. And it's because he's losing too many pawns. So for example, if king d8, queen check, we pick up this pawn, and White can still trade queens. For example, here, and then king h4, White takes the pawn and pushes the f-pawn home. So a really nice game. And, you know, again, the key here is just patience. You know, Karpov got into a position where it was hard for Black to make any threats, and he knew he had to open up the king side, so he opened up the g-file and then waited for Black to put his pieces in unfortunate locations, and then finally he opened it up with e4. But you saw he was really patient, just kind of passing the ball time and time again. And just a great example of how you really can just let your opponent do a lot of the work.
What kind of time control do you use?
So any questions on this game? All right.
So I can't tell you about the USSR versus the rest of the world #2 without talking about the organizer. So this match was organized in kind of difficult conditions by an English grandmaster by the name of Raymond Keene. So there you have a cover of a book that he wrote about it, and we brought it with us today, and also a picture of him taken by Mr. Biaggi. So Raymond Keene was the second Englishman to get the grandmaster title, and he was very close to the first, but he got his grandmaster title in the 70s, played a lot of chess himself, pretty strong player, but then he became more of an organizer, and he certainly did a great job organizing the USSR versus rest of the world 2 match. Well, I'll show you the timeline. You'll see what kind of conditions he worked in. But I have to tell you that Raymond Keene is also Ray Keene is also a controversial figure for a couple of reasons. Ray Keene has always been, he transitioned from a player to more of a publisher in the early 80s, and he was still working as a second for various people. Like he was Viktor Korchnoy's second in the Philippines, but Korchnoi really felt betrayed by Raymond Keene because they signed a contract where Raymond Keene would not write a book about the tournament until, so many months after the tournament was over. But Ray Keene was spending almost every evening sending telegrams essentially to London with parts of his book. He was writing it during the whole Philippines match. And you may remember that was a very difficult match between Korchnoi and Karpov, and it had its share of scandals. And Ray Keene was certainly part of that scandal. Korchnoi accused Keene of accepting a big chunk of money from future FIDE president Florencio Campomanes. So that was certainly a scandal. And then Larry Christensen, the U.S. Grandmaster, he got some funding to have Raymond Keene serve as a second in a match in Moscow in 1982. But as you can see, he was very disappointed with Keene's participation there. You have this sarcastic caption, about how hard he was working, essentially passed out inebriated. And actually at this tournament, he talks about the fact that Christensen said he was more interested in making book deals. Incidentally, the book in question was a book called Batsford's Chess Openings, published in 1982 with Ray Keene and Garry Kasparov as the authors of that book. So while in Moscow, Keene was working with Kasparov essentially to publish a book as opposed to really working with Larry Christensen. And so, unfortunately, he had a pretty bad reputation as a second, for sure. He also had a bit of a nickname or a bit of a reputation as an organizer. He was called the Penguin. And this is because the story goes in 1966, Keene played Botvinnik and showed up to the match in a tuxedo. And ever since then, he got the nickname Penguin because he wore a tuxedo. But later on, he was sarcastically called the Penguin after the Batman villain because he had some sketchy practices. And I'll just name a few of them without going into too much detail. There's been quite a lot written about this. But first, he plagiarized himself. Now, I have a tough time explaining this to my students, but if you are paid money by a publisher for content, and you give them that content, and then you take that content and you sell it to another company for more money is on top of that, that is self-plagiarism. It's unethical. And he did this rampantly with his columns in newspapers and books, and he would recycle books. And then not only self-plagiarism, he also plagiarized other people. He took content from other people and put it into his books and called it his own, and then had to settle with him out of court on a couple, or his publisher had to settle with him out of court on a couple of occasions when he was guilty of self-plagiarism. And then he also helped organize the 2000 PCA championship sponsored by Brain Games, and there's some allegations of embezzlement there. And in fact, when Kramnik defeated Garry Kasparov to become the PCA champion, Keene didn't give him the winner's trophy. Keene kept it for 8 years, didn't give it to him until 2008. So he has a very ambiguous reputation in the chess community. He gets things done, but a couple people really don't, or a lot of people really don't like him because of his business practices. But all that said, he did a heck of a job in getting this match organized. So here's how it happened. You may remember in 1983, Kasparov was a candidate for the World Chess Championship, and he was scheduled to play Viktor Korchnoi in Pasadena, outside of Los Angeles. And there's talk that it was going to be in Pasadena to try to get Bobby Fischer back involved in chess because he was living in Pasadena at the time. But the USSR essentially said that Kasparov could not participate in that semifinal because it was in Pasadena and because of this, maybe as kind of foreshadowing of the Olympic boycott. And also Smyslov, who was the other semifinalist, could not participate again in that candidate cycle against Max Ribley. You may know that Korchnoi did not accept Kasparov's resignation from the match, and instead requested that the match be held somewhere else where Kasparov could participate. And so that was organized in London. And that was an important step in mending relationships between Korchnoi and the Soviet Union. They saw that as a very gentlemanly gesture to not accept the automatic win and go straight into the finals of the candidate cycle, and instead offered to play Kasparov elsewhere. And Kasparov won, and then he won the finals, and then he became the candidate and faced Karpov later in 1984, but we'll get to that. So because of that, that opened the door. At that contest, that candidate cycle in 1983, Kasparov actually broached the idea of having a USSR versus the rest of the world too. And he told Keene, and they talked to Florencio Campomanes, who by now is FIDE president, and the USSR commits to participating in late June 1984. There's not any big tournaments going on around then, so it's convenient with everybody's schedule, and they all agree. So now they're looking for a host. They say, well, let's have Belgrade host because Belgrade hosted the first one. Belgrade said, okay, we're going to get financing, this, that, and the other, but they couldn't. Talks collapsed, and they told Florencio Campomanes in May, can't do it. So Rome offers to host. Now, this is 3 or 4 weeks before the match is supposed to start. Then Rome says, we can't do it. We don't have the money either. So June 5th, Campomanes phones Raymond Keene and says, what can you do? And he says, well, I think maybe we could do something. So Campomanes flies to London. They meet the next day, and they start seeking out sponsors. And the day after that, they get a sponsor on board to provide, I think, £50,000 to pay for the players to fly over and their hotel accommodations. And then they're looking for some more money on top of that for other expenses. And then the match begins 3 weeks later. So really, in the chess community, getting anything organized that quickly is a testament to efficiency and motivation. So kudos then to Ray Keene for championing that match and getting it done, and for Florencio Campomanes as well, who certainly put forth quite a bit of effort to make that happen. So the venue is chosen as the Isle of Dogs. Now, why it's called the Isle of Dogs, I was trying to figure this out. There are lots of different stories. Some say an English king, Edward III, kept his dogs there, or, back in, 700, 800 years ago, or however long. But the isle is not actually an isle. It's surrounded on 3 sides by the Thames River on the east end of London. And it was a big shipping mecca. For centuries upon centuries, that's where the shipping hub was, and that's where the ships were built. And so it was a very big industrial area of London, but London has grown significantly, and it started developing. And the shipping industry kind of failed, and the London Docklands Development Corporation was established to try to rehabilitate the area, make it more commercial and residential friendly. Now, incidentally, it's one of the most expensive parts of London. The playing hall itself is pictured in the top left. That's called the Northern and Shell Building. Now that building doesn't exist anymore, and its place is this huge glass and metal, like 10-story tall building, because this is a big financial district of London. Now a lot of banks have their European headquarters in that district, and there is Canary Wharf, yes. And it's a big business district of London, and nowadays the real estate there is among the most expensive in the world, but when the match was played there, it was very, very modest. So this building up here was owned by the London Docklands Development Corporation. They had some tenants on the 2nd and 3rd floor, in particular magazine publishers and distributors, but the first floor was empty, and that's what they used for this chess match. Kind of a modest building, but certainly worked for the purposes of the match. Now, if you look on the internet and you look for photos of this event, you will see exactly one, and it's in the top left. This is the only photo you will see of this entire tournament. Pretty much every other photo here was taken by Mr. Biaggi. So you have in the top left, you have Florencio Campomanes standing behind the table, and he's here with I.M. Hassan, who was one of the financiers of the tournament, who became the honorary captain of the world side. And then you had Nikolai Krogius from the USSR, who was the captain and a international master or grandmaster and a professional psychologist who was captain of the Soviet team. Down below that, you have the playing hall. So you see it was tables lined up in a row, and there was very limited space for spectators. Tickets were very, very inexpensive, and school children got in free. So, the matches were pretty well attended. Obviously, the spectators are just right there with the players. And then they had demonstration boards along the wall also, and those windows actually look out on the River Thames. In the top right, you have Ray Keene and Lucena. You may know from the Lucena position. Oh, that's him. And then below, you have Raymond Keene with Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time. To make this match happen, We've talked about Garry Kasparov, we talked about Keene, we talked about their involvement, and on the title slide I have Viktor Korchnoi. I talked a little bit about his involvement, but I need to expand on this. Keep in mind that from 1978 to 1984, Karpov and Korchnoi played something like 40-something chess games without shaking hands. They stopped shaking hands in 1978. There was a lot of bad blood there. Korchnoi defected from the USSR. He was living in Switzerland, and obviously that made him an ostracized kind of black sheep, and the Soviet Union had an embargo against Viktor Korchnoi. In other words, Soviet players would not play in tournaments with Viktor Korchnoi present unless they were the Olympiad or the World Championship. Anything else they would not participate in, and that resulted in Soviet players not participating in some tournaments and Viktor Korchnoi not participating in certain tournaments. This changed in 1983 when Korchnoi graciously offered Kasparov he denied the forfeit and offered to play him somewhere else, and they played in London. Karpov and Korchnoi met in April 1984 in a tournament in London called Phillips Drew. They met in round 8. Korchnoi arrived for the match 3 minutes late, apologized to Karpov, and they spontaneously shook hands. And this is kind of symbolic, and it kind of represents a thawing in their relationship. And after that, when the Grandmasters were presented at USSR versus rest of the world, when Korchnoi was presented, Kasparov and Karpov applauded, and the rest of the Soviet delegation kind of didn't know. Do I applaud? Don't I applaud? Am I going to get in trouble for this? I'm not sure. And by the end of the tournament, Korchnoi was talking and socializing with a lot of his old friends. So this was a turning point for Korchnoi's relationship with his former colleagues as well. And at the bottom right, I have a photo of Mikhail Baryshnikov, the famous ballet dancer, who was present actually at the opening ceremony. Mr. Biaggi says, quote, "One thing I should mention is that shortly after the opening ceremony and with the game started, I had finished taking pictures and was surprised by an audible murmur in the crowd as they all seemed to look in my direction. So looking around, I found that right next to me was Mikhail Baryshnikov. I decided not to take pictures of him and left him to his privacy." Baryshnikov had defected to Canada in the 70s, and he also was interested in trying to reestablish some sort of at least a cultural connection between the Soviet Union and the West. And he said at that event, quote, "This kind of event has to happen to establish any relations." So there was hopes that this would be an opportunity for more cultural connections and collaboration between the players and the athletes, because obviously the Soviet Union chess players were highly respected. So it was thought that this would lead to a thawing of relations between the two, and to a certain extent it did, particularly with regard to Korchnoi. Speaking of Korchnoi, let's look at Korchnoi versus Polugaevsky. They're both playing board 3, and that was done for strategic reasons. And for that analysis of the game,
so, this game is a good example of a couple things. It's a good example, first of all, of the power of the two bishops, and second of all, it's a good example of transferring advantages. So, let's see what Korchnoi did. So first of all, he plays kind of a risky setup, generally speaking. I mean, for the most part, this kind of King's Indian attack-like setup wasn't that popular back then. It was more common to just play d4 and e4 and play those kind of setups. I mean, as black, the King's Indian defense had taken on its own life, especially with Kasparov taking up its mantle and Gligerich and Geller developing it. But so this was kind of a risky idea from Korchnoi, but he actually didn't go for e4 this game, as you'll see. He plays for c4, which tries to go into an English variation, and he had an interesting kind of novelty at the time in mind. So he played this new move, bishop b3, and he's being sneaky. So his idea is to play queen b3 and not allow black to play queen b6 in turn. So he's hoping black will have to put his queen more passively placed than normally. But unfortunately, the time has revealed that it's not really the best plan. Black can essentially equalize by d takes c4 here, and like I said, the point is here black can ruin white's plan. So if white takes back, black can just trade queens, and really black has no particular problems here since white can apply pressure to the queen side like he does in actual games. But this was a new move at the time, and it worked. So bishop b7, and now queen b3. So like I said, the problem is that it's difficult to defend this b7 pawn without making a concession. b6 wouldn't be a good idea because this weakens these light squares, especially in the long diagonal. White could follow up with knight c3, knight d4, and the pressure on the queen side is kind of annoying. So in the game, he decided on queen c8, which does defend b7, but the queen is not well placed on c8. It can be harassed by a white rook, as you'll see, and it's also just passive on c8, right? It doesn't really have a very good future there. So white lines up the rook with the queen. And now, unfortunately, black has to take with the e-pawn, because take with the c-pawn, then we have this discovery on the queen. Now, this is a really nice move. It's a good way of defending the knight, and opens the way for white to play e4, right? Now, unfortunately for black, although white's pieces look kind of unstable, considering the bishop's not defended, and the knight's only defended by the bishop, black can't really take advantage, and moves like c5 don't work. White can just capture on d5, for example, and it's not very good. And now e4, white opens up the center. The threat to doubling the pawns on f6 makes black retreat. And now it looks like maybe black's making some headway, because if white captures on b6, black can open up a line for that rook on e8, and it doesn't look like the position will be that passive. And knight d6 isn't that great either, because now black can exchange a pair of pieces, and this doesn't end up well for white. Right? For example, here, just takes, and after exchanging that, white's doing fine, but black is too. So how did Korchnoi keep his initiative here? Well, what can white do to not lose the thread?
F4?
Well, you get this knight on c4 under attack.
Anything with discovery on the queen?
Yeah, you might think you could try taking advantage of the rook being in the same file as the queen, but how, right?
Knight to d5?
Yeah, it turns out that's what he did. Yeah, and the activation of the white knight is not easy for black to solve. So he took on c4, takes, and now his problem is that if he takes the knight, then white plays e takes, and this pin on the c file means that black loses the piece back, right? So say knight g5, just d6. So in the game, he played queen d8, right? Black's going to lose the bishop no matter what. If bishop d8, white can just play knight e7 and get the bishop that way. So no matter what, white's going to win that bishop. And so white's initiative is kind of fizzled out a little bit, but white's transferred that initiative, advantage in development, to the two bishops. And this is not a trivial advantage. I mean, even though material is equal, in all honesty, black's position is rather hopeless already. White has an open position in the two bishops, and it turns out it's really difficult to defend this for black. So b4, now this is kind of resembles a minority attack we saw earlier in the Karpov game, right? White wants to isolate a black pawn on c6 and make a weakness. Now, when you have the two bishops, every step closer you get to the endgame is helpful, right? That's one thing you should always keep in mind. If you have the pair of bishops against two knights or a bishop and knight, if you ever get to an endgame, the closer you get, the easier it is to win. Two bishops are a powerful force. So white, of course, will love every exchange that he can make, as long as he's keeping the two bishops, of course. In this case, he wins that pawn. The bishops create a really nice crossfire. Black was already hard-pressed to really find a good reply. For example, if rook d8, just simply bishop d6, and it's already hard to see what black can do, right? Rook d6, just bishop c5. Black's just moving the rook back and forth. But now black has this problem with the knight. going kind of far in enemy territory here. White takes advantage of the fact that Black's king is poorly placed. White threatens bishop f8, followed by bishop h6, and near checkmate. So Black has to give his king a square to go to, but it's not enough. And he had actually just resigned here because so White can win. How does White win here?
Rook d7 check.
Rook d7 is probably good enough as well. But White can be more direct.
Bishop f8.
Yeah, bishop f8. So now, say king h7.
Then rook d7.
Yeah, rook d7, king h8.
Bishop g7.
Yeah, bishop g7, bishop f6, and we pick up the rook on b2, right? It's almost checkmate, black can block. Yeah, at this point he just gave up. So, of course, I made it look really easy, but that was because he exchanged pieces and got down to this endgame to begin with. So, always keep that in mind when you have two bishops. Pretty much any endgame will be good for you as long as your opponent doesn't really have active pieces. And he makes it look really easy here, but it's because he kept that principle in mind, right? So, two things there. He took advantage of the fact that he was active. He kind of struck while the iron was hot, and then he changed it into the two bishops, then went to the endgame and won. So he makes it look really easy, but there's some important concepts there for you guys to learn from. So any questions about this? All right.
So I have for you the rosters of both teams. And at the end, I'll show you the results. But with the rosters, I have as many original photographs as possible. I would like to note that Korchnoi and Polugaevsky, they had quite the history. Their history goes back to the 60s, maybe even before. They've known each other for a long, long time. After the games, they did joint postmortems in Russian, and they spent upwards of 20 minutes going over their games with each other and, with onlookers and with members of the press, if members of the press were nearby. And this was part of that series of improving relations between Korchnoi and his former colleagues. And so that was seen as an important gesture that Polugaevsky would stay, and chat with Korchnoi, who had been ignored by dictum for 6+ years by the Soviet Union. All right, so the USSR team, and I have kind of an individual analysis of all these players as well. So if you look at the names, well, having Karpov and Kasparov on boards 1 and 2, that's pretty scary. But you also notice seated Vasily Smyslov and Mikhail Tal, two former world champions as well. So that in itself is a pretty scary team. But the rest of their team is quite capable as well, as we'll get to. So board 1, Karpov, current world champion at the time that this match takes place. His match against Kasparov is scheduled to start later that year in October, I believe, and it ends up running until January or February before it's called off because it lasted so long. And Karpov is actually the world's number 2. Kasparov actually has a higher rating, but as world champion, obviously, he gets board 1. On board 2, the aforementioned Garry Kasparov. Now, Kasparov had, and you'll note this is a picture from the candidates match, actually, where he played Korchnoi, and I have a quote from Mr. Biaggi below. But he had recently started playing internationally, particularly in the West. He had played a couple of tournaments in Eastern Europe, but this is London 1983 was really the first time he played in the West. And then, in 1984, he's still pretty young, 21 years old, one of the youngest participants in this match. But he's a top-rated player in the world. And, in fact, the end of Ray Keene's book is devoted to wondering or musing about who might win between Karpov and Kasparov later that year. Who could have predicted that it would have gone so long and ended the way it did in such controversy? That's in the Kasparov lecture, part 1, if you're interested. So, board 2, Garry Kasparov. Scary. Board 3, Lev Polugaevsky, who was actually a participant in the original USSR versus the rest of the world. So he'd been around a while. In between matches, the players, as Mr. Biaggi explains, would sit and play cards. And on this instance, he takes this picture, and then Karpov tells him to let them enjoy their free time. So Polugaevsky had quite a bit of experience, match experience, and tournament experience, and so he was certainly a wise choice. Unfortunately, he was paired against Korchnoi, who was obviously one of the rest of the world's team's strongest players. Board 4, Smyslov. Now, you may look at Smyslov, who's 63 years old at the time of this tournament, and think that's somewhat surprising. And yet, Smyslov was as I mentioned, he was a finalist in the candidate cycle the preceding year, losing only to Kasparov. So Smyslov was still a very dangerous opponent, one of the world's top players in 1983 after winning the World Championship, almost 30 years previously. So he's still a threat. Incidentally, Mr. Biaggi has very fond memories of Smyslov. So board 4, Smyslov, so you have Karpov, world champion, Kasparov, future world champion, Polugaevsky, and then Smyslov, former world champion.
Interesting tidbit about Smyslov, by the way. Does anyone know what Smyslov is I guess, infamous for? He has a statistic you probably don't want.
Most times participate in the candidates without winning?
Nope.
I think he was a candidate like 12 times or something.
His stay as the world champion was the shortest.
Oh, yes, you're right. Vaganian won the rematch. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then Tal.
I think he was world champion for maybe even less than a year.
I think you're right. I think it was like 11 months or something before Vaganian got the rematch and won pretty. Smyslov beat him fairly convincingly, but then Vaganian came back and beat him convincingly. You're right. But he was a candidate many, many years beyond that. Board 5, Vaganian, who at 2630 is one of the top-rated players in the world and was coming off a win at Hastings in 82 and 83. So he was one of the strongest players in the world, and he was arguably in his prime. Board 6, Alexander Beliavsky, who had been like a junior world champion, and then he won Vacancy in 1984. 20 years old, I believe, the youngest participant. But you see, the Soviet Union put him on board 6, and had quite a bit of confidence in his ability, and it was justified. He is, to me, the MVP of the whole match, and we'll get to his results a little later on. Board 7, Tal. Imagine you have Mikhail Tal as your number 7. It's kind of like the 1970 match where I think he was around number 7 as well. So he had been a world champion himself. He was still quite the strong player. Very, very dangerous, obviously. He was winning tournaments, including blitz tournaments, until the late 1980s. So in our Tal lecture, we talk about his longevity, and it was certainly notable. And a very appreciated person. Tal, and this may strike you as somewhat strange, but perhaps not if you understand Tal's personality. Mr. Biaggi talks about the fact that after the games, the Soviets and the rest of the world had an analysis room. And it was a place you could adjourn to and chat about matches, chat about adjourned games, chat about, whatever. And the rest of the world team was not nearly as coherent or as cohesive as the Soviet team. And Tal and Kasparov were in that analysis room pretty much every day, consistently. So they were perhaps two of the more devoted players to their team's cause. And that may strike you as somewhat surprising, when you're 47 years old and you're former world champion and you're this, you're that, the other. But that just is a testament to Tal. Board 8, Yuri Razuvaev, there on the left. Now, Razuvaev was in as a replacement. And I'll tell you who he was replacing in a moment. But Razuvaev at 2,500 is one of the lowest rated players on the Soviet team, but he had won a tournament in London in 1983, so he had pretty successful tournament history of late. So he was on board 8. Board 9, Yusupov. Now, We don't know, at least I don't know as much about Yusupov as a player as I do about Yusupov as a writer, because he's gone on after his playing career to become a very successful coach and writer. But he was certainly a strong player in the match. He had, a very high rating. He had won several notable tournaments, and so it was not surprising that he participated in this particular event. And then board 10, Andrei Sokolov, 21, tied with Kasparov for, second youngest player essentially. So note that we have 3 Soviet players that are 21 or under among their top 10 boards. And he had just come off of a Junior World Chess Championship. And so even though his FIDE rating is a little bit lower than average, he was quite the strong player. First alternate, Vladimir Tukmakov, and I talked about him in the Caruana lecture because he is now a coach. He has coached both Caruana and Garry, and I said in the Garry lecture that he was going to come up in this lecture, and that's because as an alternate, he had some very important appearances in the match itself, as we're going to see. Here he is playing against Korchnoi. Korchnoi kind of had Polugaevsky's number, and Tukmakov came in to try to stop those losses. And then Romanishin as their second alternate didn't play as many games as Tukmakov. I think he had 2 games. We'll see that in the results later on. I mentioned that Razuvaev was there as an alternate to replace someone who was not present. Guesses on who that is? I'm sorry? Spassky had defected to the west, or kind of. He had moved to France and started playing for France. It was not Spassky. But you're right to think of a Soviet world champion. Petrosian. Tigran Petrosian was 55 years old at the time of the tournament, and his FIDE rating is quite strong. But he was not able to participate. Unfortunately, he was in the midst of battling a terminal illness, and he actually died of stomach cancer 2 months after this match. So even though he had played in some tournaments in 83, and I think a few at the very beginning of 84, maybe one in the beginning of 84, he was not able to participate in this tournament. And so Razuvaev took his spot. So one notable absence for the Soviet side. We're going to see the notable absences for the rest of the world side. Before then, let's get to our third game. This is from round 4, and Garry Kasparov against Jan Timman.
So Timman actually had done pretty well against Kasparov, and this was a matchup the world actually liked. Previous to this match, Timman had won 1 and Kasparov had won 1, so they were even going in, I believe. So the world had every reason to be somewhat optimistic, although there is a 100-point rating difference, even though the record was equal. All right, so Timman plays a Queen's Gambit Decline. Probably a good, solid opening choice against someone like Kasparov. Against Karpov, I might criticize it, but against Kasparov, probably the right idea. So I applaud that. And now Kasparov plays a sharp line. So White's idea here is to castle queen side and throw the pawns down to attack on the king side. So this means that Black essentially has to open up the center. Now, one book, if you haven't read it already, it's called The Art of Attack in Chess. It goes over this kind of principle. If you control the center, you can attack on a flank. So, for example, in this position, a move like c6 would be totally uncalled for. White could simply castle queenside, and then play h4 and g4 and g5, and that attack is going to be hard to repel because of White's dominance of the center. So this means that Black has to contest the center one way or another, even if it means giving up a pawn, at least temporarily. And already it's kind of a critical theoretical point for Timman. So bishop e6 is probably okay, but probably a safer line would have been bishop takes c3. And I especially say safer because against Kasparov, if you can trade queens, it's going to make your life a lot easier. So now after, say, bishop e6, Black can play rook c8 and wrap up that pawn. Now the endgame is not without problems for Black, especially considering this weakening on d5. But I'd rather defend maybe a somewhat worse ending than a position with queens on the board against Kasparov. But that's just me. Everyone else is perfectly free to feel differently. But so now the problem, like I was saying, is white gets to keep queens on the board. And king b1 is useful to get the king off the c file and as a tactical point. So Timman took on d5, and the reason was rook takes c5 would be a bad idea. Why did Timman avoid playing this? What would Kasparov have done here?
Taken with tempo on the bishop.
On f6?
Yeah.
No, knight takes f6. White may even be lost after g takes. Black threatens the queen and taking on a2. Yeah, I think white's in trouble there, actually. But what does white do? If you don't take an f6, your knight's attacked again, right?
Or b4.
Yeah, b4. It's forced, but it turns out it's good. So the problem for black is the queen can't go anywhere. So black is virtually forced to take the queen. Then now white can take on f6 and take on a5. And black has a problem because white can go down here on d8. Now if black plays rook c8, white's just in the endgame of a pawn. All right, white can play a move like knight d4, and black does not have enough compensation, combined with the extra pawn and this wrecked kingside structure.
But is the a2 pawn vulnerable in that one?
Right, so for example, if you take on a2, the problem is that white can play rook d8 check, and the fact that this knight's pinned means that black is doomed, essentially. There's no way for black to move that knight or the rook, so black is in serious trouble. For example, king g7, white could play like knight d4, and because that knight and rook are stuck, black is just dead. So because of this, the c5 pawn is immune for now. So black got rid of the knight and then kept developing. So now black wins back one of the pawns, so he remains down only just one pawn. So white develops a rook and threatens bishop takes f7. And here was Timman's first serious mistake. So he played queen b6, and it turns out this gives Kasparov too much activity. Queen e7 would have been a better chance here. And black has pretty reasonable compensation for the pawn here. But he played queen b6 with the hopes of getting counterplay against b2. But it turns out that it's essentially a bluff. So Kasparov simply plays queen b7. So the queen is really active on b7, attacking f7, putting pressure on b7. Unfortunately, tactics don't work out for black. So what Timman had been intending was knight takes a2, because now black threatens to take on b2 with checkmate, right? So the knight's immune. But it turns out it doesn't work, unfortunately. White can play rook c2, defending the pawn. Now say knight c3, king c1, say knight e4, white can take on f7. And now I believe the move was bishop e6. Yeah, I believe the move was bishop e6, and black has problems on the white squares on the king side. So it turns out this really wasn't as effective as he hoped. So he played rook f8 defending f7, but this was too passive. White threatens e5 with the fork. Now he installs the bishop on d5. And this is a really sneaky move. Now, black would love to get a position with opposite color bishops. Now, as you might know, if black can manage to trade this knight on f3, it's going to be hard for white to win, because opposite color bishop endgames are notoriously drawn, right? Because black could put all his pawns on dark squares, and white would have no way to attack them with just a light square bishop. So queen c2 is sneaky, because now knight takes is impossible because of e5. So white can keep knights on the board. Now black played g5 to stop white from playing f4, right? f4 followed by possibly e5 is a threat. So g5 keeps the knight, but unfortunately it also weakens f5, which is a juicy square for a white knight. White invades with the queen, and then Timman resigned, right? King takes h5, queen g7, and the threat against the knights, and f7, and the king itself, right? Queen h7, followed by mate is a problem. So he just resigned at this point. But I really like Kasparov's play, just very energetic. You know, moves like queen c2 I think are really nice. You know, one thing you always want to be aware of is the kinds of pieces that each side has, right? Before I talked about two bishops, you know, two bishops against a knight and a bishop, or two knights. And in this case, having opposite colored bishops. It's always something to be aware of, these piece imbalances, and what kind of pieces you want. And in this case, Kasparov knew he wanted to keep a pair of knights on the board, right? For example, if white had taken on e5, this would have been a serious mistake, because now any kind of endgame is going to be really hard to win. It'd basically be checkmate or bust at this point. Okay, so any questions about this game?
So even being up 2 pawns is not enough to compensate for the opposite colored bishops.
Yeah, exactly. Like going back here, so say takes. Now if the threat against b2, it may be, so say white played queen f5 here, this endgame is actually drawn, unfortunately.
Wow.
I mean, there's two reasons for that. One is it's hard for white to make a pass pawn on the king side. And two, it's going to be hard for white to crash through and force a queening pawn. So say, for example, here black could play king g8. And, you know, I'm not sure what white could do here.
Can't get the king toward the a6 pawn.
I mean, you could try. I mean, the problem is, for example, bishop c4, a5. Black could play king f8, king e7, move the bishop, put the pawn in f6, and once the bishop can attack those dark squared pawns, then the king can go over to b8 and make sure white can't make a queen. So yeah, winning those opposite color bishop endgames is always really difficult. Okay. Any other questions on that? All right.
So we went over the Soviet team. Let's look at the rest of the world. And it's a pretty diverse team, and I've got country flags to help orient people into who's from where. So the rest of the world team has quite a mix of players. Some seasoned veterans like Korchnoi and Bent Larsen. Some up-and-coming young talent like Yasser Sirawan. And players from, you know, lots of different continents. So we have Europe, the Americas, we have Philippines represented. So a good variety there. But a team that, you know, obviously they came together for this match, didn't know each other all that well outside of this chess match, so they didn't have quite the same history. And in the middle you have Mr. Hassan, who was the honorary captain, but he didn't make any of the strategic decisions. He delegated that to someone else. You'll notice Jan Timman actually has a cast on his leg. Mr. Biaggi said that it was because he injured it during a football game. So there you go. You play football on a rest day or in your off time and might break it. So board one, Ulf Andersson from Sweden. He was one of the highest rated players in the world. He had won Viking Z 82-83. He was a good choice to pair against Karpov, at least at the time. I mean, you don't really have anybody who can hold their own against Karpov, but it's hard to pair someone up against Kasparov as well. But Ulf Andersson was selected for that duty. Board two, we've already talked about Jan Timman, who is also 32, kind of in the prime of his chess playing career. Won a couple of tournaments, including Sarajevo 1984. Incidentally, this is not from a match. This is from analysis afterward. You can tell because of the type of set they're using. They're just either A, playing blitz, or B, analyzing together. So Timman from the Netherlands. Korchnoi from, well, he's representing Switzerland. His flag is Switzerland, but he was previously of the Soviet Union. He is one of the older players, but if you remember my lecture on Viktor Korchnoi, also known as Victor the Terrible, incidentally, Korchnoi was in the top 100 players until his late 70s. So we think, oh wow, he's 53, but he had 25 more years of playing at that level ahead of him. So let that be inspirational, perhaps, or scary to you that Viktor Korchnoi was, I think he beat Fabiano Caruana when Caruana was like 16 or something. And take that, you little whippersnapper. Lubojevic from Yugoslavia. Now, this is the flag of Yugoslavia at the time. Yugoslavia doesn't exist anymore. It's now Serbia. But at 26.35, he was actually number 3 in the world behind Karpov and Kasparov. He was paired against Smyslov, and for strategic reasons, this was seen as a somewhat favorable match for the rest of the world. We'll see if the results bear that out. Ribley had been the semifinalist beaten by Smyslov at the candidates tournament, and I say beaten. He was and he wasn't. Smyslov won the match, but they actually drew it. They actually had to decide that match by spinning a roulette wheel because they went through like all the tie breaks, and Smyslov won on the spin of the roulette wheel. But he had played Smyslov to essentially a draw in their match, and so he was seen as a strong player, but they didn't want to pair him up against Smyslov again, so he was paired up against Vaganian. And you see again, young, early 30s. Yasser Seirawan. Now we know Yasser Seirawan from his for many reasons. Number one, if you watch YouTube, you know him from the Chess Club and Scholastic Center of St. Louis, where he is very active in his teaching there, and he's in lots and lots of videos and very instructive. But his inclusion at this tournament was probably a mistake. Now, in a tongue-in-cheek fashion, I say that his status as Cosmopolitan Bachelor of the Month, for which he received a bunch of marriage proposals by mail, true story. But Seirawan was selected. Now, he was selected, Keene says he was selected because he could, on a good day, he could beat anybody in the world. Well, he didn't have good days at the tournament. In hindsight, the American representative for this tournament probably should have been Walter Brown, who was certainly a lot higher rated and a lot more experienced. But Seirawan was selected. He went up against Beliavsky, lost his first 2 matches, and then he was subbed out. So did not have a good tournament. Board 7, Dr. John Nunn. Now, I give you his honorific here. It's quite an interesting story. I don't know if you know about John Nunn, but Nunn was admitted to Oxford at the age of, I think, 14. And he was the youngest person in something like 400 years to be admitted to Oxford at his age. Graduated with a degree in mathematics at the age of 15 in 1973. Later on got his PhD in mathematics, and he was a professor at Oxford. And he stopped, so he got his PhD in 1978. And then I believe he stopped teaching around 1980 to focus on chess. So he was certainly a grandmaster, a very strong chess player, but a brilliant mathematician in his own right. And when I was reading the story of his accomplishments at such a young age, frankly, I was quite surprised. We have several players on the Soviet team who have advanced university degrees, but a lot of the international players, they focus exclusively on chess. None is certainly someone who bucks that trend.
The English seem to have a trend in this, by the way. One of the modern-day players like this is Luke McShane, who's an investment banker and also, one of the top 100 players in the world. He's one of the only top 100 players in the world I know today that has a serious full-time job. So,
that's an interesting point.
Yeah.
Robert Hubner on board 8 had the task of going against Razuvaev, and Hubner had a long and distinguished career as well, certainly came in with some experience. Hubner from West Germany, this is obviously before reunification, and Hubner was a psychologist by training, so also quite educated. Board 9, Tony Miles, a grandmaster and quite a character. You may have seen pictures of Tony Miles. He suffered from chronic back pain even in his 20s, and you'll see pictures of him playing lying down. He'll be lying down on his stomach, like propped up, like, on his arms, and he'll just reach out and make his move. And they had like a massage table set up for him to lay down on so he could play his games that way. But his opponents apparently didn't mind. And Miles is kind of a mercurial temperament. He says what he thinks, and that got him into some I don't want to say I don't want to say disputes, but certainly some arguments with Raymond Keene, among others. So Tony Miles was on board 9. And then board 10, Eugenio Torre from the Philippines. So Torre had been a candidate in 1983. And at 21, he was quite a young player, an up-and-coming talent. And he was seen as a potential threat, particularly on board 10 against a Soviet team, because at 25.65, he had quite a strong rating, for someone on board 10. So strong players, and then as with the Soviet team, there were alternates. Alternate number 1, Murray Chandler, a young British grandmaster who filled in on a couple of occasions. And their second alternate, surprising that he was their second alternate, Bent Larsen, who participated in the first USSR versus rest of the world in 1970. Now, I'm not sure, and in fact was board 1 over Fischer. I'm not sure why he was picked as an alternate for this particular tournament. Perhaps that was his choice, but he filled in admirably when needed on the top boards. I talked about Petrosian being a notable absence for the Soviet team. Can you think of any notable absences for the rest of the world team? Nigel Short was too young, I believe. Yeah. Fischer, of course. Yes. Bobby Fischer stopped playing chess after his world championship in 1973. Didn't show up or didn't agree to the match with Karpov to defend his title in 1975, so FIDE decided to bestow that world championship on Karpov by default. But Fischer was living in Pasadena, and they called this his wilderness years, and I called it that in my lecture on Fischer, and nobody really saw him, and he was kind of isolated and doing his own thing. He'd been arrested in Pasadena in 1982 and wrote a book or a little pamphlet on how he was tortured in a Pasadena jailhouse, and people already started wondering about his mental state. Well, they've been wondering about that for years, but anyway, what you may not know is that Florencio Campomanes visited Pasadena, California in either early 1984, I think early 1984, and the rumor was that he was trying to convince Fischer to participate and get back into chess and participate in this match. Now, who knows if he even met Fischer, if they discussed, if Fischer refused to see him or if Fischer said no, but obviously at 27.80 FIDE, remember Kasparov is 27.10, and he's the number 1 player. He is certainly a notable absence. And then Boris Spassky, a previous world champion, still participating in tournaments. This is in Thessaloniki in 1984. This picture is taken. Spassky chose not to participate. He was invited, but he chose not to participate because it had been too soon since his defection. Now, I don't really buy that it was too soon since his defection because he had moved to France in about 1976, and he had been representing France in the Olympiad since the late 70s, and this was at least 5 years after that. But for whatever reason, he chose not to participate. And then Hort, who had been in the USSR versus rest of the world number 1, I think he was on board 4. He was still quite a strong player, but he had already committed to participating in the Czech championship, the championship of Czechoslovakia, that is. And so he had a prior commitment and chose not to participate. Portish, who had participated as well in USSR versus the world number 1. He was invited, but he was offered board number 7 or 8, and he felt that was not befitting his ranking. And that may make he was offered board 7 for tactical reasons, but as the number 7 ranked player in the world, he thought he should have been placed higher than that. And I agree, he should have at least been on board 6 instead of 0-1, but that's beside the point. So he refused to participate. And then Walter Brown was not selected to participate. I don't know why. In my opinion, dumb reasons. At 25.85, he was certainly one of the top players in the world, and he certainly was more experienced. He had more poise under pressure. And so I think that Brown should have been selected. That was a tactical mistake on the part of the organizers. But even if he would have been invited, I don't know if he would have attended or not. I don't recall him talking about that in his book when we did that lecture on Walter Brown. So let's look at our fourth and final game, and this comes against it's Beliavsky against Larsen. Now, I have pictured Sirawan, who lost his first 2 games against Beliavsky and then was pulled and replaced with Larson, and Larson tried to contain Beliavsky, who was surging, and we'll see if he was able to do that by looking at our fourth and final game.
I'm curious, do you know if Miguel Najdorf was too old? It seems like he would be a good candidate. But
I don't know.
He might have been too old because Najdorf was one of the... I mean, there are other players like Smyslov who were present, but Najdorf was one of the participants in the Zurich 1953 tournament. So, even if he was young at the time, that means he would have been, in his 50s at this tournament. So maybe he was too old.
Oh, actually, he would have been 74.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Okay, that explains it. All right, so let's take a look at one of Beliavsky's successes. Earlier Lucas talking about how Beliavsky was kind of the MVP for that USSR team. So here's a good example of that. So Larson was always an experimental guy in the opening, and this game was no exception. Of course, nowadays, every single Caro-Kann player knows that you play bishop takes e3 followed by e6 here. But Larson played this knight gf6 move, and I suppose he was playing it because he'd had success. I forget who the victim was, but he had won kind of a quick and dirty game as black just a couple months prior to this. So I guess he figured maybe Beliavsky hadn't seen it, or that he would get him in the same thing, but this experiment did not work out well again. And kind of the problem for black is that this knight gets randomly placed on h7, which is not a great square for it. So Beliavsky just develops quickly and normally. And Larson prepares the castle queenside, but Beliavsky doesn't let him. Of course, the threat to f7 means it's not easy to do so. Now rook d8. Now taking on e5 isn't helpful either, because it leaves black with this permanent space issue on the queen side. It's going to be hard to defend these squares since white has these pawns clamping down. And know what I said earlier about that knight? It's still in exile on h7, right? You can't even go to g5 because white will just say go back. So rook d8, and now rook e1, and white makes a serious threat in knight takes f7, followed by queen takes e6, and then taking on e7. So this is something black can't ignore. So castles. But now white has a really thematic move for this variation in the Caro-Kann. As a hint, this kind of tactic was featured in one of Carlsen's famous games. Carlsen had a famous, attacking game where he used this tactic too. Bishop e3. Black could probably play queen a5 and be okay. Knight c4, probably queen a6, again attacking a2. So I hope you guys remember this tactic. It's just really thematic for these Caro-Kann positions where you have a pawn on h5 and a knight on e5, and the move is knight g6. So the point is that if black takes on g6, then white takes with check, and black has a problem with the hanging bishop, and you can't play rook f7 because of h takes g6. And Carlsen had a famous game. I wish I remembered his victim, but when Carlsen was really young, and it featured the exact same kind of tactic. So remember this knight g6 idea. It crops up a lot in the Caro-Kann. White has his knight on e5 and pawn on h5. Very thematic. So Larson plays rook e8. Then now white can take and activate the other knight with gain of tempo. So another tempo. And now bishop comes out to f4, supporting that knight on d6. It's just an absolute monster. So now the rook comes up, hinting at an attack on the g-file from g3. And white plays this really sneaky move. I say sneaky because why didn't Larson take on a2? It was definitely not a blunder. But how can white now win? Turns out it's rather forced.
So rook a3.
Yeah, rook a3, and I would move the piece on the board, but I want people watching too to visualize. So rook a3, queen d5. That's the only safe square for the queen. And then what? What's that? Yeah, c4. Black only has one place he can go to with the queen. Queen takes g2. Then what?
Back to G.
Yeah, rook G3. Now D5 is taken, E4 is taken, F3, F2 is defended. So Queen H2 is the only move. So Queen H2, and then how does White win?
Check with the rook. Rook takes.
Right, rook takes G7 check. And after King takes G7, Bishop takes H2, White wins the Queen for a rook, right? So yeah, a good practice and visualization there. You should be able to calculate that. Okay. So of course A pawn is immune. So rook D8, Larson tries to force Beliavsky's knight out, but it turns out it's not very helpful actually. Rook A3, now knight C4, now Queen B4. So Black will be happy if he can finally bring this queen back home since it's being chased around. But here Beliavsky came up with a really clever combination. So it turns out you can trap Black's queen here. See if you can find out how Beliavsky did it.
Bishop D6.
Yeah, Bishop D6. The point is that after rook takes D6, we now do what? C3, Queen B5, and yeah, rook A5. And the queen's out of squares. Now Black does get a rook and a minor piece in exchange for it, but in this position it turns out it's not enough. These weak queenside pawns are really the problem here for Black. Now B6 doesn't turn out well, but other moves don't either. Rook D7 is bad for the same reason, because White can play Queen E5, attacking the rook and threatening Queen B8. So Black doesn't really have any good options here. This rook is running out of squares. And now the rook and knight can't both be saved. The rook can't go anywhere to protect the knight, so he's going to lose it. So at this point, I think Larson just resigned. Right. Yeah, a really nice, sharp game, kind of punishing Larson's experiment. And really energetic play. We saw the rook lift. We saw the knight coming to D6. We saw the knight G6, thematic idea. So a really instructive game, especially if you play E4. You know, this is a great example of learning from how to attack the Caro-Kann. So any questions on this one? All right.
The game Warren was referencing with Carlsen was played in 2004 at the Chorus tournament, and his opponent was last name Ernst, E-R-N-S-T, if you want to look that up. Yeah, that knight G6 move was move 18, and Carlsen ended up checkmating his opponent. So I have some more photos that I want to show you, and also to talk a little bit about some side events and the results and things like that, then we'll take your questions. You may wonder, how did Kasparov and Karpov get along? I mean, their relationship later on would be quite sour. There would be a lot of animosity there. And they were scheduled to compete against one another, but from all external signs, they were quite convivial, and even, they were quite friendly with one another. And the players on the Soviet side, I've already talked about this, would stick around and chat with each other and analyze games and go over adjournments, and there's strong cohesiveness there. The rest of the world team, not so much. They were more focused on individual results. And so Kasparov and Karpov were quite visible. They didn't just run back to their hotel after their games. They stuck around, chatted with other players, chatted with the media, and they did some touristy things. Now, members of the Soviet delegation would slip off and go to the stores. So they would commandeer the limousine that had been used to take members of the press from the playing hall to the media center. And the Russian delegation commandeered it to go shopping, apparently, and that caused a little bit of scandal. But they also got out and about and saw things. So Karpov took a boat trip to Greenwich, which was about 20 minutes away or so, east-southeast of Dogs, and took a boat trip, and the only Westerner invited was Mr. Biaggi, who was able to go and take photographs. And he talks about the fact that the security around Karpov was quite tight, and this isn't surprising. We've talked about this when we've done lectures on the individual players, that they had quite the delegations with them. Press secretaries, security, groupies perhaps, I'm not sure. So Karpov took some, boat trip, kind of let loose a little bit. And this is not what we think of when we think of Karpov. When we saw him in the press conference earlier, he looked relaxed, he looked happy. And here he looks like he's, carefree and having fun. Kasparov participated in a simul after the event was over. This was July the 1st. And he participated against 10 players, 5 American juniors via satellite, and 5 English players in person. The 5 English players managed to get 1.5 points out of 5 against Kasparov. There were 3 draws, including Michael Adams, 12-year-old Michael Adams, Mickey Adams, now a grandmaster, managed to draw against Kasparov, quite impressive. Of the 5 American juniors, they all lost, unfortunately. So there were some notable up-and-coming, promising players from the British side who participated. And I said I was going to talk about the results, so let's look at those. On the top boards, the USSR did pretty well. Karpov and Kasparov, as can be expected, they won their head-to-head matchups. Korchnoi was able to thwart Polugaevsky. Tukmakov came in to get an important draw there. Smyslov only ended up playing 2 rounds, and Tukmakov came in for him as well. So and had an important win and a draw. So you see Tukmakov now is actually 2 out of 3, which is a quite strong score for an alternate. So he came in and had a very important performance. Ribley took his head-to-head matchup against Vaganian. Beliavsky slaughtered Sirawan and also beat Larson and ended up 3.5 out of 4. So he had certainly the performance of the match. Tal, strong showing, 2 out of 3, not bad. And then Razuvaev, equal, good enough. Yusupov, equal, good enough. And then on the bottom boards, Miles, Torre, and then, Torre in particular had strong performances. So toward the bottom, Korchnoi and then the bottom boards tended to do pretty well. And this is kind of the inverse of what happened in USSR versus Rest of the World 1. In Rest of the World 1, the top couple of boards with Fischer and Larson, they outplayed, they had stronger scores than their opponents. But at the bottom, the Soviet players just outclassed the rest of the world. Here it was closer at the bottom of the boards, but they had the advantage at the top of the boards, and that shouldn't be surprising when board 1 and board 2 are Karpov and Kasparov, 2 of the probably top 5 players of all time. But you may be struck by the number of draws in this tournament. There were actually 14 decisive games out of 40, so the other 26 were draws. So 35% of the games were draws. Now, in 1970, only about half of them, 21 out of 40, were draws. So there were, it was far more decisive, if you will. Incidentally, as of today in the candidates tournament, there have been 12 out of 44 decisive games. As of yesterday, around 10 out of 40. So that percentage is even lower. But that's to be expected. There's not as much parity between the current candidates as there was in this particular tournament. You look in the ELO differences, for example, you would expect some more decisive results to have, say, a 2620 against a 2500, for example, on board 8. In terms of works cited, I used 3 real sources here. I used an article that had been written in Kingpin magazine in 2007 about Raymond Keene and his legacy. I used extensive email correspondence with the match photographer. Over the course of several months, we exchanged probably 15, 20 emails, and I certainly thank him for all his efforts in taking what was essentially a box full of negatives and going through them and printing and digitizing and then transmitting those photos to me. And then I used the book by Raymond Keene, and I also took some of the pictures from that book. See, this book that I have here, that's actually Warren's copy, it is the book that everybody got, but Mr. Biaggi actually has a limited edition version with a bunch of photographs in it, so almost all the black and white photos that you saw of the match came from that book, and I can't find it anywhere. There are probably very, very few in circulation, and I'm sure as one of the participants in the tournament, at least as a photographer, Mr. Biaggi, of course, it features his photographs. received a copy. Unfortunately, in this book that you can find as a used book, there are no photos at all. So those were the three main sources I used. If there are any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them as best I can. And, of course, if they're chess-based, I'll defer to Warren. But by all means, ask away.
So I'm one of those people who knows Sirwan from YouTube series.
Sure.
Big, smart guy. And you say he really showed poorly, and he obviously did. What would you say his big weakness was in this game?
In terms of his play, I couldn't really say. I don't have the chess acumen to be able to analyze his play with any degree of authority. I can tell you that Raymond Keene said that he's capable of beating anybody on a given day, but as we saw, he's also capable of losing on any given day to anybody. So perhaps what I would say about Sirwan is that at this stage in his career, he was inconsistent. Most of the players in this tournament had the chess ability and the experience to play solidly in whatever lines, whatever openings, and as you see from the results, most of them managed draws. Sirwan is the exception. Didn't manage any draws, and he lost on both the white and the black side against Beliavsky. We can't, at least I don't think it's fair to put the blame entirely on Sirwan. It could be that Beliavsky was playing quite well. I mean, he beat Bent Larsen as well. 3.5 out of 4 is an incredible result at a match of this caliber. So it could just be that Beliavsky was on a streak akin to, say, a Caruana at Sinquefield 2014, when for the first 7 games or so he was just unbeatable. So it could be a combination of Beliavsky playing really strongly and Sirwan not having the match and tournament experience to draw upon. Warren, did you happen to look at Sirwan's games and notice anything in particular?
I mean, the impression I got was Sirwan just played weakly. Yeah, I think this was his, as far as I know, this was probably his first exposure to this level of chess. I mean, I don't know if he had even played anybody as strong as Beliavsky even at this point.
I think he'd beaten Karpov once.
Oh yeah, there was that famous game where Karpov did blunder.
Yeah. So people point to the fact that Keene says, he's capable of beating anyone at any time. Other criticism I've read said that they chose Sirwan because he was, I don't want to say glamorous or flamboyant, but he made a strong impression. And that so they were looking for an American player to try to provide some sort of representation, and their choices really were Walter Brown, Larry Christensen, or Yasser Sirwan, and they chose Sirwan, I think, incorrectly over Walter Brown. I think would have been the better pick. But then again, this match wasn't just about who wins. It was also about providing the best tournament to secure future sponsorship. So, I mean, in that sense, you can't fault it from perhaps a business perspective, but from a match perspective, it certainly didn't work out as well as the organizers, I'm sure, hoped.
How many more the world, the USSR or Russia versus the rest of the world? How many more tournaments were there?
There was one more. USSR, or it was Russia. It was after the fall of the Soviet Union. Russia versus the world. I believe it was in 2000 or 2001. I want to say 2001. And it was a much bigger match. It occurred over several different days. And I think the world won that something like 52-48. You might think, well, Russia lost or the Soviet Union lost a lot of its players because of the breakup of the Soviet Union. But I remember the ELO rating, the average ELO between the two sides at Russia versus the World 3 was like 1 point different between both sides. So it was quite equal, but and they had Kasparov and Kramnik and Karpov, and you really have a hard time betting against a team like that. But the world did pull off a win. Yeah, it's not occurred since then, to my knowledge.
Is there any rumors of another one happening?
I kind of doubt it, and the reason I say that is because I don't think Russia has the depth that they once did. If you look at the number of grandmasters in the top 100, certainly Russia is the strongest country represented among that top 100. But if you look at the top 20, I think only 3 of them are Russian. You have Karyakin, Svidler, and Kramnik. So that means 17 of the top 20 are the rest of the world. So I don't know that you have that same level of balance that you had in 1970, 1984, and in 2001, I think. Certainly the world team would have been stronger in 1984 if they had had some of those other players. Obviously, Fischer is a glaring absence, and Hort.
Did they won the Olympia?
The Russia, no. The last Olympiad, I believe, was Armenia. Yeah. And then the next Olympiad, I'm calling it right now, is going to be the U.S. Just saying. Well, you got Caruana, Nakamura. Yeah. That should be a strong team.
But that's only a 4-person team, right?
Well, yes, and an alternate. I think two alternates, maybe. So, incidentally, you may wonder if Bobby Fischer was in chess shape during this time. I may have mentioned this in my Fischer lecture, but he lived with a German grandmaster in the early 80s for a short stint, a couple months. And the German GM has said that when Fischer was there, they played probably 100 blitz games over the course of those few months, and this grandmaster managed 1 draw. And the rest of the time he was just blown off the board. He said while they were playing, Fischer was spouting off variations as he was continuing to play, because obviously growing up in New York, he certainly was a fan of trash talking during matches, but it just shows that he was just blowing his opponent off the board. And he was also staying on top of chess developments. He talked about the analysis that he did with Fischer of some of the strongest players in the world in their matches, and Fischer was pointing out weaknesses in their play. And the German GM said, yeah, I couldn't really fault him for his reasoning on any of it. So Fischer certainly could have participated and held his own. And reportedly, they were trying to line up, rumor has it, up to $5 million in funding to get him to participate in this match. I don't know if they ever did get that guarantee. I don't know if Fischer was offered that and turned it down or not. But even if he would have been offered it, I can see him turning it down. At this point, money wasn't his concern, even though he was living essentially in poverty. But if they had had Fischer, if they had had Spassky, even though, the Soviet side had Kasparov and Karpov, it would be hard to bet against the rest of the world team. And today I think it would be even more one-sided. Yeah. Other questions? Well, we're discussing what to do for next month. There have been a number of requests. You requested Karas. We certainly would like to consider that. We've had lots of requests for Botvinnik. They said, well, you did him in the Soviet School of Chess, but Botvinnik deserves his own lecture. Can't really fault that. David Bronstein, Warren and I are particularly fond of his book on the Zurich candidates in 54, and that's certainly a possibility, either Bronstein or that particular tournament. So check the schedule. It is going to be the last Thursday in April, and we'll try to post that in the next week or so and let you know what the topic's going to be, but certainly appreciate you coming out for this one, and we'll stick around in case you have any other questions. But we'll go ahead and cut this off.